Lights, camera, action, and welcome back to Soundtrack Collector. I'm your host, Christopher Spencer, author of film and television soundtracks 1950 to 1979, a critical history published by McFarlane and Company. If you're as obsessed with movie music as I am, you're in the right place. This month, I'm starting a series that takes an in-depth look at science fiction soundtracks of the last 100 years. I know that sounds like an awful lot to get through in one short month, but don't worry, today we'll start by breezing through the early years when SF cinema was still in its infancy and spend most of our time in the 1950s when SF cinema was arguably in its adolescence. Future episodes will cover the 1960s and 70s, the 80s and 90s, and then the 2000s to present. I even have an episode devoted to SF soundtracks from TV shows planned. If you haven't already, you'd better subscribe to stay up to speed. So, whether you're a science fiction fan who wants to know more about SF soundtracks or a soundtrack collector who wants to know what SF soundtracks to get, you'll find this month's slate of videos invaluable. So, let's get started by traveling back in time to the origins of SF cinema and uncover how this genre and its soundtracks evolved from the late 19th century to the golden age of the 1950s. Sci-fi isn't just about aliens, robots, and time travel. It's also about sound. It's about the theremin that gives you chills, the orchestra that makes you feel the vastness of space, and the electronic experiments that make your brain say, "What is that?" Buckle up, because we're going deep into the scores that shaped this otherworldly genre. Here's the fascinating thing about sci-fi soundtracks. They're often rooted in classical traditions. Composers like Bernard Herrmann and Max Steiner drew inspiration from Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring and Gustav Holst's The Planets. But then they added a twist, whether it was theremins, electronic hums, or otherworldly choral arrangements. It's this blend of the familiar and the futuristic that makes sci-fi soundtracks so powerful. They remind us of where we've been while pointing us toward where we're going. Let's rewind to the very beginning. SF cinema is practically as old as filmmaking itself. Way back in 1897, French filmmaker Georges Méliès was already dreaming up fantastical worlds. First he gave us Godzilla and the Automation, where a mechanical man springs to life. And then came A Trip to the Moon. You've seen it, an astronaut in a bullet-shaped rocket crashing into the moon's face. No soundtracks here, of course, but this was the spark. Méliès set the template for SF cinema. Bold visuals, daring ideas, and a sense of wonder. The scores would come later, but the seed was planted. By the 1920s, sci-fi was finding its groove in cinema, and so was film music. Metropolis from 1926 by Fritz Lang is a cornerstone of SF cinema. It's all about a dystopian future where workers toil under a city of decadence. Gottfried Huppertz wrote the score, fusing Wagnerian grandeur with the modernist tension of the time. Even today, you can hear echoes of Metropolis in John Williams' work on Star Wars, or perhaps Vangelis's Blade Runner. Also, there was Alita, Queen of Mars, a Soviet film about love, revolution, and of course, robots. Scores from this era weren't always preserved, but the orchestras that played to these films created an atmosphere that would become essential in science fiction cinema. Awe, danger, and the strange allure of the unknown. The 1930s were a time of experimentation, and science fiction started mingling with horror. Think Frankenstein, 1931, The Invisible Man from 1933, and King Kong from 1933. Max Steiner's score for King Kong was groundbreaking, a sweeping orchestral soundtrack that made Kong's climb up the Empire State Building feel larger than life. Meanwhile, science fiction serials like Flash Gordon, 1936, leaned on bombastic, adventurous scores by keeping audiences on the edge of their seats. These weren't yet the fully fleshed out symphonies of later decades, but they set the stage for what was to come. Beyond SF's blending with horror, there was the 1936 film Things to Come. Arthur Bliss's score for this monumental film is nothing short of a milestone in cinematic music. Imagine this: H.G. Wells himself, the visionary writer of the film, saw the soundtrack as integral to the film's very DNA, collaborating closely with Bliss to craft it. Though they scrapped the ambitious plan to record the music first and build the film around it, the result was still breathtaking. Critics immediately hailed the score as one of the movie's standout elements, and even today, its majestic themes, from haunting dystopias to the triumphant rise of civilization, continue to resonate. Bliss's work not only redefined British film music, earning comparisons to Vaughan Williams and William Walton, but also foreshadowed the grandeur of composers like John Williams. The 1940s were a rough time for science fiction fans and soundtrack lovers. Horror was king, and science fiction took a backseat. But there were glimmers of hope. Serial heroes like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers were still zipping around space, albeit with limited budgets. More importantly, composers were refining their craft, even in low-budget productions. Music was evolving to emphasize drama and character, paving the way for the next big leap in science fiction soundscapes. Sci-fi in the 1950s wasn't just escapism. It was a mirror held up to the world grappling with communism, nuclear threats, and fears of the unknown. The films of this era reflected those anxieties and paired them with a fascination for space exploration, fueling the post-war dream of conquering the stars. Soundtracks played a pivotal role in bringing these stories to life, whether it was the eerie wail of the theremin or the bombast of full orchestras. The music made audiences feel both the terror of the unknown and the thrill of discovery. Let's start with two films that kicked off the decade: Rocket Ship XM and Destination Moon. Faraday Grofe Sr., best known for his Grand Canyon suite, scored Rocket Ship XM with a blend of sweeping orchestral grandeur and the eerie, alien sound of the theremin. The theremin was used to highlight Mars's unsettling atmosphere, creating a juxtaposition between the familiar sounds of Earth and the strange, otherworldly vibes of space. Meanwhile, Destination Moon was scored by Leith Stevens, who took a more grounded classical approach. Stevens' use of vibes in the track in outer space introduced a suspenseful, ticking motif that would influence later composers like Jerry Goldsmith in the Alien soundtrack in 1979. Together, these scores showed how music could transport audiences beyond Earth, long before we ever reached the moon. If one score defined science fiction in the 1950s, it was Bernard Herrmann's work on The Day the Earth Stood Still in 1951. Herrmann stripped away the excess of traditional orchestration, opting for a smaller ensemble featuring two theremins, reed organs, amplified strings, and percussion. The result, a soundtrack that was alien, minimalist, and deeply unsettling. Tracks like Gort used sparse arrangements to make the music more threatening. This score didn't just accompany the action, it defined the tone. Herrmann's innovative techniques influenced not only sci-fi, but also the minimalist composers of later decades, like Philip Glass and Steve Reich. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Dmitri Tiomkin's score for The Thing from Another World, also from 1951, was loud, brassy, and unapologetically bold. While Herrmann leaned into subtlety, Tiomkin went for bombast, using an unusual ensemble that included 3 harps, 2 pianos, and even a flexitone. The theremin makes an appearance here too, acting as a metaphor for the alien threat. Tiomkin's aggressive, militaristic score mirrored the story's conflict between the military's brute force and the scientist's intellectual curiosity. It's a score that practically shouts, "The Cold War is here." Leith Stevens returned to science fiction with When Worlds Collide, a sweeping operatic score that followed the Golden Age tradition of closely mirroring on-screen action. Its dramatic brass and strings captured Earth's imminent destruction and humanity's desperate attempt to survive. By contrast, Stevens' The War of the Worlds took a more rhythmic approach, incorporating Latin-inspired beats to drive the action. While unconventional for an alien invasion film, the swirling strings and ominous horns delivered a palpable sense of danger. No discussion of 50s sci-fi soundtracks is complete without Forbidden Planet. Lewis and B.B. Barron created the first fully electronic score. Using cybernetic circuits they designed themselves. The result? Warbling, gurgling, and squealing sounds that didn't follow traditional melody or rhythm but perfectly captured the alien atmosphere of the film. This score was revolutionary, influencing countless composers and paving the way for electronic music and film. Sadly, union rules prevented the Barons from receiving proper recognition, but their work remains a masterpiece of experimental film scoring. Carmen Dragon's score for Invasion of the Body Snatchers from 1956 is a masterclass in crafting suspense and paranoia through music. Known for his innovative use of low staccato piano notes, Dragon's composition not only underscores the film's themes of terror, but also captures its emotional depth. Tracks like No Bananas Today and Shadows in the Night enhance the tension, weaving a narrative of fear that aligns perfectly with the story. It remains an essential piece of science fiction and horror film history, showing just how powerful music can be in elevating a cinematic experience. The 1950s were also a golden age for creature features, and their scores delivered thrills on a budget. Irving Gertz, Herman Stein, and Henry Mancini teamed up for It Came from Outer Space in 1953, blending theremin with shrill strings and agitated brass to create a spooky, otherworldly vibe. Bronislaw Kaper's Them from 1954 brought giant atomic ants to life with vibrating brass and frantic percussion. Herman Stein's Tarantula from 1955 evoked the menace of the giant spider with dissonant strings and Stravinsky-inspired suspense. Even low-budget B-movies got creative. Ronald Stein's scores for It Conquered the World and Attack of the 50-Foot Woman showcased his ability to craft tension and excitement with limited resources. These soundtracks may not have had the polish of big-budget productions, but their inventiveness made them unforgettable. Speaking of creature features, let's talk about Godzilla, or Gojira as it's originally known, and the groundbreaking soundtrack that roared to life alongside it. Akira Ifukube's 1954 score didn't just accompany the story of a giant radioactive lizard, it helped define the genre. The film itself is a biting allegory, with Godzilla representing the catastrophic effects of nuclear devastation on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ifukube's music amplifies this narrative, blending tension, tragedy, and awe into one unforgettable soundscape. Legend has it, Ifukube began composing the score before the film was even complete, and the result is one of the most recognizable themes in cinema. The pounding drums, the clashing cymbals, combined with a vigorous string riff, captured Godzilla's unstoppable power and the military's desperate attempts to fight back. This theme, steeped in the influence of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, became a hallmark of the franchise. Ifukube's score is more than just bombast. Tracks like the grim, choir-backed funeral dirge reflect the somber consequences of humanity's actions, making the music as much a character as Godzilla himself. The influence of Ifukube's Godzilla score cannot be overstated, like Monty Norman's James Bond theme, John Williams' Imperial March. It became the sonic identity of the franchise, evolving with each sequel while remaining instantly recognizable. Godzilla wasn't just the start of Japan's sci-fi monster movie empire, it was the birth of a cinematic musical legacy that that continues to shake the world. Of course, there are loads of other Japanese SF monster movies from that era that we could delve into. Let me know if you want to see a video just on that topic alone. Although better known for its horror movies, Britain's Hammer Studios delivered its own brand of science fiction cinema with the Quatermass Experiment. Composer James Bernard relied on strings and percussion to create a tense atmospheric score that elevated the film's low-budget production. The series continued with Quatermass 2 in 1957 and Quatermass and the Pit from 1967, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll be talking more about that one in the next episode. The 1950s gave us the sound of science fiction, theremins, electronic experiments, and lush orchestras that transported audiences to alien worlds and brought their fears to life. These scores weren't just accompaniments, they were storytelling tools that shaped how we experience science fiction to this day. So what's your favorite sci-fi score from the 1950s? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more deep dives into the world of movie music. This is Soundtrack Collector signing off. Until next time, keep collecting those sounds of the silver screen.